Доброго ранку, шановні глядачі! Вітаємо вас на телепрограмі Альберта Контакт. Я Василь Яворський. В околиці містечка Сейнт-Пол в провінції Альберта Українсько-канадська фундація громадянських свобод або Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation відкрила новий пам'ятник в честь українських жертв інтернування в Канаді під час Першої світової війни. Сьогодні ми пропонуємо вам цікавий репортаж про церемонію відкриття цього нового пам'ятника. А в цій першій частині ви побачите, як відбулася панахида в пам'ять жертв інтернування в Канаді, і також почуєте цікаві промови різних доповідачів.
With the souls of the righteous departed, give rest to the souls of your servants, O Savior, preserving them in the blessed life which is in you, O lover of mankind.
You see before you the internment statue that's entitled 21 Strands, depicting the life-size replica of 3 men imprisoned behind the barbed wire fence. This statue was inspired by a photo taken at Castle Mountain internment camp in Banff, which was known to be particularly harsh and abusive.
I'm quite thankful for the opportunity to unveil the 21 Strands today, the initiative within our community to have that happen here. The 21 Strands is a story about our ancestors that were interned and offered and encouraged to come to Canada, and then during the war interned and put in concentration camps, worked our multiple parks. And this is an opportunity to share that story on our kitchen tables. I've always say, when you can see something like this and take it back home and share it in the kitchen table is when we create those relationships of understanding. And this is a great opportunity, and to have it happen here is, I'm quite excited about.
Facts give us knowledge. Stories give us wisdom. I hope to share a little knowledge on Canada's first national internment operations. After the entry of Great Britain into World War I on August 4th, 1914, the Government of Canada issued an order in council that provided for the registration and in certain cases for the internment of enemy aliens. Suddenly and entirely as a result of government decree, many Ukrainians and other Europeans found themselves described as enemy aliens. Over the next 6 years, various repressive measures would be directed against them. Most of the 171,000 Ukrainians living in Canada were, by 1914, settled in the prairie region, although significant communities began forming in Ontario and Quebec. Since these immigrants had generally come to Canada from the Austrian crown lands of Halachina, Galicia and Austrian, Bukovina, their citizenship, but not their nationality, could be described as Austrian or Austrian-Hungarian. Ironically, even though the British Foreign Office twice in 1915 instructed Ottawa to accord preferential treatment to Ukrainians who were deemed as friendly aliens, their lot did not improve. The racism of the day ruled. Those so categorized were under the terms of the same War Measures Act of 1914 that would be later used against the Japanese, Italian, and German Canadians during World War II and the Quebecois in 1970. They were subject to imprisonment in one of the 24 receiving station and concentration camps across Canada. Of these 24 internment camps, 4 were in Alberta, Castle Mountain Cave and Basin in Banff National Park, in Jasper National Park, Lethbridge, and Munson, Alberta, which is just outside of Drumheller. And if you enjoy Canada's national mountainous parks, just cross into the BC side and you have Yoho and Revelstoke National Parks. Between 1914 and 1920, 8,579 enemy aliens were incarcerated, among them women and children. Of this number, 3,138, according to General Otter, who led the internment operations, could be classified as prisoners of war. 817 were actual enemy servicemen. 1,192 were civilian German residents of Canada. Of the remaining 5,441, a majority, and perhaps as many 5,000, were of Ukrainian origin. Over 80,000, mostly Ukrainians, were categorized as enemy aliens and obliged to report regularly to the local police authorities or to the Northwest Mounted Police. They were issued identity papers that had to be carried at all times. The penalty for non-compliance was arrest and possible imprisonment.
Значить, сьогодні ми приїхали з Едмонтона в Сент-Пол. Тут відкривається така, в парку там є плак, ніби пам'ятка тим українцям, які були інтерновані, які були заслані фактично в концентраційний табір, табори, як вороги нації, як громадяни іноземної, на той період це була Австро-Угорщина, і громадяни Австро-Угорщини, де фактично вони працювали як раби, без права бачити свої сім'ї, без права бачити своїх дітей. Їх не питали, чи хочуть вони, чи не хочуть. Це одна з темних сторінок історії Канади. На жаль, вона також є. І, на жаль, ми хочемо, щоб люди це знали, щоб в майбутньому таке не повторювалося ніколи.
In addition to the approximate 5,000 Ukrainians, the affected communities included Bulgarians, Croatians, Czechs, Germans, Hungarians, Italian, Jews, and various people from the Ottoman Empire, Polish, Romanians, Russians, Serbs, Slovaks, and Slovenes. Most of the prisoners of war that were of German or German-speaking Austrians were separated from other internees and placed into first-class category. This meant they were kept generally in good conditions. Their camps were comfortable, and they were not obliged to do heavy labor. The other non-German or German-speaking Austrians, I'll say Nashi, were sent to work sites in Canada's frontier hinterlands to places like Spirit Lake, Quebec, which is really in northern Quebec, Castle Mountain, Alberta, Yoho National Park, and many other places. They were required not only to construct the internment camps, but to work on road building, land clearing, wood cutting, and railway construction projects, often to the profit of their jailers. And this was contrary to the 1907 Hague Convention, where POWs were required not to work. They were required not to work, except for their own upkeep. But this didn't take place for the Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans. The War Measures Act was implemented on August 20th, 1914, and its effects had a crippling legacy. These people were interned not because of any wrongdoing, but it's because of who they were. This is about human rights on the most fundamental level. In total, 107 died by illness, such as TB or the influenza, and a number were shot trying to escape. 106 were deemed insane, but by what was coined the barbed wire disease. One of the gravest forms of injustice is when the victims cannot tell their story, when they are silenced by denial or indifference, when they are marginalized and punished to the periphery of history. In November of 2005, at the initiative of Dauphin Swan River, Manitoba Member of Parliament, Mr. Inky Mark, the Internment of Persons of Ukrainian Origin Recognition Act was passed, obliging the Government of Canada to negotiate an agreement concerning measures that may be taken to recognize the internment for educational and commemorative purposes. The Act initiated negotiation work with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and the Ukrainian Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko.
I think the monument's important is because so few of us understood it. None of us really knew this history. And I think it explains better a part of who I am, my heritage. I understand myself better as a Ukrainian Canadian. My parents didn't teach me to speak Ukrainian, and I would ask them why, and they would say, because we don't want you to be different, we don't want you to stand out. I never understood. And now, seeing what transpired 100 years ago, I have a better understanding of what they went through, and here we are generations later, it's still trickling through us. So I think it's important to celebrate their sacrifice. I think it's important for us to take some ownership for our own heritage and to celebrate it and be proud of it, because we're part of the bigger fabric. And there were many lessons for me here today on a lot of levels. So I think it was just a beautiful day.
In May 2008, representatives of the Ukrainian community reached an agreement with the Government of Canada, providing for the creation of an endowment fund, the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund, to support commemorative, educational, scholarly, and cultural projects intended to remind all Canadians of this episode in our nation's history. The Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund exists to support projects that commemorate and recognize the experiences of all ethnocultural communities affected by Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. The internment has had lasting scars on the Ukrainian Canadian community. In 1941, the RCMP report on the 8th National Convention of the Ukrainian National Federation, UNO, to use the Ukrainian acronym, noted that many of the community's leaders remained in fear of the barbed wire fence. The interned men, women, and children and their families suffered by their unjust internment. Many of them never told their future families of their internment. Simply put, it was wrong. History's taught us that when any ethnic group is degraded, it degrades all human values. It degrades the teaching of religious doctrines. It degrades the core values of pluralism and democracy. Most of all, it degrades the moral character of a nation.
Okay, my name's Paul Wynnyk, and I'm here actually today to commemorate, of course, those Ukrainian Canadians who were interned during the First World War and had to register as enemy aliens. And I'm proud to be here because I have a personal connection. My grandfather, Peter Wynnyk, came to Canada in 1903 as a 12-year-old boy and actually homesteaded in this very area, Stry, which is about 30 kilometers west of here. But during the First World War, he was not interned, but he had to register as an enemy alien. So, you know, once again, it's important, I think, that we remember things like this, and it's important to me personally that I took the time to be here to honor my grandfather.
Original first instructions given out said this: go about your business, cause us no problem, and we'll not trouble you. That was the original, very sensible kind of government instruction. But within a few weeks, as it became clear that this would not be a war that would end by Christmas, the government passed the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act would be the very same legislation that was used in the Second World War against our fellow Japanese, German, and Italian Canadians and some Jews. It would be used again against some of our fellow Quebecois in 1970. This is the face of a typical enemy alien fact, this man was Romanian from Calgary. This is his police mugshot. Now, some people said, what are you doing? How could you be calling us disloyal? And in fact, you see in the bottom quotation from a letter that was written from a man in Camarno, Manitoba, Paul Wynnyk, who said, look, there's no movement of disloyalty on the part of Ukrainians in Canada. We're loyal citizens. We came here to help build the country. We're not trying to undermine the war effort. What are you doing? And yet, people were herded together, confiscated valuables. They took the men from their women and children and marched them into receiving stations. This is actually in Quebec City. We used to think it was Montreal, but it's actually Quebec City. You can see a lineup of men in the early years of the war being put on trains. And these trains would then take them across the country to 24 internment camps. This is the locations. You've heard these described before. It's in the brochure you can pick up at the back, so I won't go through them all. But there were 4 in Alberta, as you know, and of course, camps everywhere in Canada. So this is very important. This wasn't just about Western Canada. There were camps from Halifax to Nanaimo. So there were camps in every major city practically, or receiving stations where people were held temporarily before they could be transported somewhere else. The camps were very quickly segregated into 2 categories, as you heard. First class were real Germans, prisoners of war, a minority. The majority of the internees were civilians, the majority of whom were Ukrainians and other East Europeans. Those were the second-class prisoners, and they were the ones sent to Canada's frontier hinterlands, to places like Banff. Now, you might say, whoa, going to Banff, government expense, that's a holiday. Not in those days. These internees dug the ditches, made the roads, they created Banff. So when you go to Banff today, and it's a beautiful place, I don't hold it against Banff, this is what happened there. But when you look at the roads and the bridges and the infrastructures, if you go play a round of golf on that golf course, remember that all of that was built by forced labor, Ukrainian and other East European forced labor. This is a listing of the camps. Again, we don't need to go through them very quickly, but you can see there were camps just about everywhere. Some bigger, some smaller. The last one to close was Kapuskasing. Kapuskasing ran until 1920. Now, you might remember that the Great War for Civilization, the First World War, ended on the 11th of November, 1918. We still call it Remembrance Day. The internment camps continued until June of 1920. Almost 2 years after the end of the war, Ukrainians were still being interned, rounded up, forced to do heavy labor for the profit of their jailers, not because they'd done anything wrong, but only because of who they were. Now, was this all just a big mistake? Because sometimes people say, well, you know, the government just didn't know. It was a war, panic, hysteria. You take measures and you regret them. Remember, we were part of the British Empire. This is the actual document that we found in the British archives that shows that the British government told the government of Canada, Ukrainians, although they're called Ruthenians, that was the old name for Ukrainians, Ruthenians and these other people are friendly aliens, not enemy aliens. They are friendly aliens who should be given preferential treatment. Ottawa ignored what they were being told by London. We're not quite sure why.
The unveiling of the statue and plaque here in St. Paul, Alberta, on September 22nd, 2019, is very significant. There was not an internment camp here, but being part of Kalena country, where there were thousands and thousands of new Ukrainian immigrants that had come for a better life, and here they were, you know, trying to make homesteads, and they end up having to be interned or registered as enemy aliens and report on a constant basis to the local police authorities. Having this statue and plaque unveiled today allows people to remember what happened here 100 years ago. Here as in Canada. There were 24 internment camps across Canada, As I mentioned, there were no internment camps in this part of Alberta, but there were 4 internment camps in Alberta. 2 in Banff National Park, 1 in Jasper National Park, 1 in Lethbridge, 1 in Munson, Alberta. So for the Ukrainians of this area, I think this is important. It's a reminder of what their grandparents or grandfathers had to go through.
Mary Monkohaskett was 6 years old when she was arrested. A 6-year-old girl born in Montreal, arrested with her father, her sister Nellie, her brother, her mother and father, and transported from their Ukrainian Catholic parish in Montreal to Spirit Lake, where within a few weeks she watched her sister Nellie die. And Mary Monko was the second survivor who I met of the internment operations. And I remember talking to Mary and saying to her, Mary, Japanese Canadians are asking for an apology from the government of Canada. They're asking for every survivor to get a tax-free $20,000 compensation package. They want this and they want that. And I said, so Mary, what do you want? What do you want? I mean, you're one of the very few people, Ukrainian Canadians, who survived the internment operation still alive. You want $20,000. You want an apology from the government. And this was a time when Mr. Chrétien. And she looked at me and she said, she used to call me Dearie. Dearie, what am I going to use $20,000 for? Buy a Cadillac? That was the way she talked. She says, if you're going to run a campaign, I don't want money. Your campaign, she said, should be about memory, not money. Gave her a big hug. I'm a conservative in my heart, I guess, and the reality of it is, this is exactly what I believe in. I believe that society should acknowledge past injustices, but I don't think a Canadian today, I don't care who he is, or where he's from, or where she's from, or what their background is, should apologize to me for something done 100 years ago. That's nonsense. I don't think I should be paid as a descendant for something that happened to my grandfather. Remember, acknowledge, understand, speak about it, commemorate it like we did today. That's important. Some people say we need to learn from history so that we don't repeat it. Other people say, well, what we learn from history is that we don't learn anything from history. You can take whatever side you want on that argument. But the point is, surely remembering is important, that we have to stand in defense of our civil liberties and human rights, particularly in times of international or domestic crisis. That is important. And Mary taught me that lesson. And so we went forward with the campaign.
Завдяки зусиль активістів нашої громади, такі пропам'ятні заходи відбуваються по цілій Канаді, які визнають цей злочин, вчинений державою на початку ХХ століття. Ці заходи включають пам'ятники, книги, фільми, пропам'ятні дошки та освітні програми.